Hello everyone, and welcome to what is the 100th SWH podcast. And we are down in Leith at the fantastic Leith Depot. We want to get someone special guest to be on our 100th, and we thought there would be no one better than someone who shapes the musical tastes of the nation, and that of course is Mr. Vic Galloway. Hello Vic.
Hello, thank you very much for having me, and I really do think of this as an honour to be on your 100th podcast, and very kind words as well, thank you.
Well, the last time we spoke, it was about your book, Songs in the Key of Fife, which was a great success, a fantastic book. And now we're going to talk again about another book, but this time Rip It Up, and I think most people listening to this will know about Rip It Up, because it's not just a book, it's an exhibition at the National Museum of Scotland, and it was also a television programme. So huge undertaking, and your book is essential to this. So talk a little bit about how Rip It Up came about.
Yeah, well, Stephen Allen is the curator of the exhibition. He's actually a Scouser, but he's married to an Edinburgh lass, and he's been in Scotland for many years and brought up his son here and so on. And he is, I think, I'm trying to get his title right, I think he's head of learning at the National Museum of Scotland. And he's just a massive music fan. He's a complete music nerd. And I kept seeing him at gigs, festivals. He would go to a lot of the fence home games stuff. He would go to Lost Map nights. I'd see him at indie bands and shows and so on. So on. He loves Camera Obscura, and he and I just kept bumping into each other and chatting at festivals and gigs and so on. And he's of the age that he one of his first favourite bands, one of the bands that he called his own, rather than copying his big brother or sister or whatever, was the Rosillos. He loves the Rosillos, and it was like one of his teenage bands. So he's really into punk, post-punk, that kind of era and onwards, and is an avid music fan. And he turned to me. He'd read Songs in the Key of Fife and really liked it, and that was, very, very nice of him to say so. And the National Museum of Scotland do these late nights when they have, a bunch of bands themed around an exhibition and some performance art, and there's a crying baby in the background.
Oh, vanity.
I would sometimes host, and I usually do host the lates in the museum in Chamber Street. So I kept bumping into Stephen at gigs, at the lates. He said nice things about Songs in the Key of Fife, and then eventually he said, look, I'm looking to do this music exhibition if I can get it up and running. If the high Hegians at the museum will allow it. We've had the video game exhibition that they did, and that was a massive success. Maybe I'll be able to do a pop music exhibition. If it comes about, if I get the green light, would you be up for doing the accompanying book? And I was like 100% yes. And I said, what are you looking to cover in the exhibition? And he went, the history of Scottish pop, everything. And I was obviously quite daunted by this, but I thought, well, the fact that he's asked me and the fact that he likes Songs in the Key of Fife and my radio shows and all of that stuff, I thought, well, I have to take up this challenge. So that's how it came about initially. And then that was about two and a half years ago that we were talking about this, and then it takes about that amount of time. Yeah, just to go through all the bureaucracy involved, pitch it to the right people and so on. And then eventually, I'd already said yes to doing the book, but you have to, dot the I's and cross the T's and all that. And eventually I started writing it at the end of last year, sort of December last year. And initially they wanted me to hand it in February, 2 months to write the history of Scottish pop. I went, no. But I did sort of deliver it mid-April. Yeah. So even that, 4 months it was fairly tight. And also, it's quite a short word count as well. I mean, it's roughly 50,000 words, which, it's short enough, though. Yeah. I mean, if you think of a normal novel being roughly 100,000, I mean, 50,000 words for spanning from the 1950s to the present day. I mean, I could have done with double or triple that word count to just flesh things out a little bit more. But I like a challenge, and I went for it, and here we go.
But having said that, often, these books which accompany exhibitions, they can be really good, and then they work well with the exhibition, but they're usually fairly thin, direct, and often quite dry, and probably could be written in a couple of months. You can imagine that time span. That's not what this is. You say it's a short word count, but it's a really comprehensive tour through the history of Scottish pop, and it's astonishing to think that that's how long you took to write it, because it's not just the time span it covers, but it's the detail inside it, and I'm guessing having to check a lot of the details as well, because the last thing you were saying before we started that, we're all kind of music geeks, and there's few people as geeky as a music geek, and if they were to say, oh, well, actually, I think you'll find that this was this.
Actually, I hate to say it, but it is inevitable. Looking back at the book, even now, sort of 6-7 months after I delivered it, there are a few little typos and errors in there, and I don't want to, I'm not going to blame my editor, and there's also there are 2 or 3 names that I really should have covered in the book that aren't in there, and I've forever, apologetic to those people who I shan't name in case people get really upset, but there are 2 or 3 musicians or acts that should be in there that I missed out, and it's not because of any malice or because I wanted to ignore them. It's purely because I forgot. When you're dealing with this amount of information, some things slip through the net. The occasional album title gets mixed up, or the release date is wrong. So I apologise. There aren't that many mistakes that I know of. There were 2 or 3. There are 2 or 3, and there are a couple of omissions. But if you compare it to the exhibition itself, the radio series that we did, and the TV series, it's the most comprehensive of all 4. So it's as I say, I would love to go into even more depth, and maybe I'll do a redux edition one day when I can double the word count, put in those acts I've forgotten in the first place, correct any typos, that kind of stuff. But as is, I'm really proud of it, and the reaction's been good.
It's a PhD thesis. They're over 100,000.
Are they? Right. Well, that could be it. Revisit that one day. Yeah.
It's not. I think perhaps what people might expect it to be is just a chronology of the history of Scottish pop, but it isn't. It's structured in different ways. There's themes. And that's why bands you might not expect appear in the same chapters. I've written down Marillion, Finney Tribe, and I think the Blue Nile all appear in one chapter.
Yeah.
How does that work? But if you could tell us a little bit how you decided to structure the book.
Well, and just going back to your previous question a little bit and statement and so on about it not being dry, and when I was talking to the publisher, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Leslie Taylor from the National Museum of Scotland publishing wing, who is my editor and the person I dealt with on a day-to-day basis when we were going through it all. She was incredibly helpful and incredibly supportive, and when I came to her with ideas about how I wanted to do things, she said yes to all of them. I mean, you know what rock journalism and rock biog writing is like. There's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This is the National Museum of Scotland, and children and people of a more gentle disposition might be reading. So
you couldn't go down the Nick Kent route.
No. Although there is mention of occasional drug use, yes. And there is like sort of alluding to the kind of swinging 60s or whatever era it would be. But I couldn't completely shoot from the hip. But at the same time, I think it isn't as dry as perhaps some other museum books, because it's about music, it's about rock and roll, and it's the soundtrack to our lives. It's also brings in fashion, culture, contemporary art, politics. You can't be as dry about it as you might be writing about the Jacobites or whatever it may be, not saying that that's not exciting stuff as well, of course it is, but I wanted it to jump off the page. That was my aim with Songs in the Key of Fife and with this book, was even if you don't know anything about the subject matter, even if you're not that interested in the subject matter, that hopefully you get to the end of a chapter and you're like, oh, can't wait to find out what goes on next. I remember with Songs in the Key of Fife, Kenny Anderson, King Creosote, gave me the greatest compliment of all, which was when he'd finished reading a chapter about himself. I got left a sort of cliffhanger, what did Kenny do next? And he was going, what did I do next? and
yeah, that's the action you expect from some pop stars.
But that's what you want. I wanted people to feel kind of excited, and I suppose the short word count has one benefit in that it's a bit of a breakneck roller coaster ride. So once you get on the roller coaster, you go straight through it all. But yes, in terms of the formatting of it and the ideas, I mean, we went through different ideas. Initially, there was going to be 10 chapters, and then 3 in between chapters, or 5 in between chapters, and because they had the ability to access this great archive of photographs and images and so on, and also go and source images from elsewhere. So, I mean, I'm really pleased with the book because obviously, it's got my name on it, and it's such an amazing thing to be involved in. But when you leaf through it, there's all this great artwork and kind of photography and so on. It's it's a coffee table book plus.
Yes,
It's a really juicy thing to have. So anyway, we settled on the fact that we got to 10 chapters. I'll read out the chapter titles if you like.
Yeah.
So there's an introduction from me setting out the stall, and there's the acknowledgements and thanks and so on. And then there are 10 chapters which are all named after either songs or albums or lyrics or whatever, Scottish artists. And what I did was 7 chronological chapters and 3 themed chapters. So that's the way it's got to be.
Yeah.
Name of a poet's song, and that's the 1950s, the dawn of rock and roll, the 50s into the 60s, kind of spans right up to the sort of late 60s, just verging on the early 70s. Then chapter 2 is Pick Up the Pieces, named after the Average White Man song, and that goes through the kind of early, mid, bordering on late 70s. Then chapter 3 is Treasure, named after the Cocktail Twins album, and that's about record shops, it's about formats, it's about merchandising, t-shirts, posters, just naming all the labels, all of them, as many as I could fit in, and record shops, and the idea that things have gone from vinyl to cassette to CD to digital, kind of back to vinyl again.
Back to vinyl, yeah.
And so that's what Treasure deals with. Big Gold Dream is chapter 4, and that deals with the kind of post-punk into the late 70s into the early 80s. Glittering Prize is chapter 5. That deals with the slightly more, I would say, mainstream pop-orientated stuff of the 80s,
Yes.
of which that's really when Scottish music almost came into its own, in terms of the global impact it had. That's not to say there weren't massive successes beforehand, but that's when it really, I think, really immersed itself in people's consciousness. Upside Down is chapter 6. That's about the sort of underbelly of the 80s, the underground stuff, the Jesus and Mary Chain, the Cocktail Twins, all the punk and post-punk and sort of more experimental music. Then chapter 7, In a Big Country, is about live music, live venues, festivals, that sort of the experience of going and soaking up live music, and a little tour around the venues, the famous venues that Scotland's produced, whether it be the Glasgow Apollo, the Barrowlands, and then even going back to the 60s and the Bungees and the Casbah and the Gamp and all these different venues that were in Edinburgh that had, you'd have the Spencer Davis Group or the Who or the Animals, whatever, passing through these venues. And so just a little nod to all of that. Chapter 8, Bandwagon-esque, is that, I suppose, the late 80s going into 90s, and I think that's the period when Scottish artists started making the decision to stay in Scotland rather than moving to London. And also, as you might imagine by the title, Bandwagon-esque, it sort of deals with the coming of age of Scottish indie music and so on, but it also covers mainstream stuff. Chapter 9, Take Me Out, Franz Ferdinand song, that's almost like basically sort of the 2000s up to the present day. And then the final chapter, Throw the R Away, is about Scottishness in a kind of loose. I mean, is that not the hardest thing to write about?
Of course it is.
Which is what you do on a daily basis, weekly
Very
basis,
much so.
and so it was in some way trying to weave a thread from the 50s to the present day as to what is Scottish pop.
Yeah.
Can it be defined and all that sort of stuff. So as I say, 3 themed chapters, 7 chronological chapters, and a breakneck pace it goes at too.
So did you have the chapters written and then come up with the songs that were going to be the titles, or how did that work?
I sort of sketched out how I wanted to, sort of had to break it up.
Yeah.
Because you get to that point in the 80s and you realise there's just an absolute wealth of bands, and it gets to the point when how much can I actually write about each one of them. So I just chopped them into chunks. It's not to say there weren't lots of Scottish artists in the 50s and 60s. There were, and doing some investigation into this, doing my research, you realise how many beat groups there were in the 60s, the Poor Souls, the Senate, the Athenians, and it goes on. And so you have to pick the ones that were successful, or, Dean Ford and the Gaylords that turned it into Marmalade, and, these kind of things. And I realised that I could probably do the 50s and most of the 60s in one chapter, whereas I needed a couple of chapters to do the 80s. So, and once I'd sort of divvied up roughly what era was going to be in each chapter, then I tried to choose a tune
for it. Well, I guess that's what the book does. It gives you an overview. It says, here's a fairly thorough overview as you will get. What you're interested in, go and find out about it.
Yeah.
So you think, well, I didn't really know Scotland had a dance music scene.
Yeah.
And then people go and find out that there's all these fantastic.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, you're looking at the 80s and into the 90s, all the sort of kind of quite hard dance. Mallorca Lee and all these guys were like, they're still DJing, and they were getting tracks into the charts.
Yeah.
TTF and all these. Some people might think it's a bit cheesy or whatever, but they were having hits, and they were huge, and and people don't necessarily put 2 and 2 together. And then you mentioned them earlier on, Finney Tribe, really pioneering band, the Shaman. I mean, people forget the Shaman were Scottish for a start, and that they went to number 1.
Exactly.
And they had huge hits, and countless others. Nowadays, if you look at electronic music, I mentioned Calvin Harris. He's the biggest pop star in the world. 10 years ago, he was stacking shelves in Dumfries and M&S. Now he was dating Taylor Swift and so on. I mean, it's nuts.
Yeah.
But, he's at the cutting edge of very commercial EDM. But then you've got churches and so on. And then on the underground, Lucky Me, Numbers, these are collectives. I mentioned Hudson Mohawk and Rusty and people like that in the book. Hudson Mohawk makes beats for Drake and Kanye West. These are the biggest stars in the world. And Hudson Mohawk is Ross Burchard from Glasgow. You know what I mean? And people don't necessarily think that we're making that kind of music when we are.
I'm making that kind of influence. I think the same thing with Gary Clark from Barry Wilson, who went over and then started writing huge hits for American stars and things like that.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the punk time, because that seemed to shape a lot of what King Scott would become, because then you had Postcard after that, and Fire and all of these labels. Because what really interests me coming from Glasgow is Glasgow in the punk scene, because it didn't really happen at the time. It wasn't very much in Edinburgh or Dunfermline. It didn't really thing. It was
well, that's it. I mean, look, you got to remember, after the Bill Grundy show and the Sex Pistols swearing on TV, a lot of people didn't want to have punk in their back garden, and they wanted to sort of ban it and so on. But I interviewed John Lydon a year and a half ago or something like that, and thankfully got on well with him. But he loved it, and he recounted. He says, "I remember it." He says, "What was it? The little province in Glasgow said, we've got enough hooligans up here without importing them from south of the border." And he burst out laughing, telling me that, and he thought it was the greatest thing. But that's what he said publicly, you know. And so I think it was after City Hall's gig with the Stranglers played, and the audience, some of the audience ripped up the seats, and so they got banned, and then there was there was also a bit of a cultural stagnation. I mean, I think Glasgow was Dirty Denim and blues rock, and there's not pub rock, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but there was a bit of a cultural awakening at that point just across the world, and kind of spearheaded by New York and by London and Manchester, and eventually by Edinburgh and Glasgow. But yeah, initially punk was kind of banned, and so people had to go and play in Silver Thread in the Bungalow bar in Paisley.
Paisley was a great place for that. You could go if you were in Glasgow and you wanted to see punk. Similarly, it strikes me in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of clubs were being closing early, and there was lots of kind of council attention and trying to check what people were doing in these clubs, and there would be buses going out to Saltcoats and to Ayr and all these places. There was a massive raise because they didn't have the same. Glasgow Council and music have got a lot of relationship.
And by the way, I would say the same about Edinburgh, the City of Edinburgh Council. I'm not going to use this podcast to make some massive political point, but we're sitting in the Leith Depot right now, and we're looking at a venue which is right next to our recording studio and countless industries and businesses here, and it's going to be knocked down or potentially changed into luxury student accommodation and blah blah blah. It's like, when are the city councils in Edinburgh, Glasgow and anywhere else for that matter around the world going to realise the importance of the culture that's on their doorstep? People come to are moving. I live in Leith, and people are moving to Leith because of its cultural value, not because there's a supermarket near their door or because there's luxury student accommodation there. They're moving here because there are great pubs and clubs and people and artists, and you know, you look at the West End of Glasgow or whatever it is, you want the council to understand that what's there. Why is Scotland pioneering in music and art, theatre and culture in general? Is because there are areas where it survives, and if you destroy all those areas, we will not have the same art and culture. So it's nothing. In many ways, nothing has changed. You know, and it's now down to the property developers. Anyway, there you go. Here ended the lesson.
I completely agree with all of that, and it is interesting. It's funny to me though that they thought that a musical movement would make Glasgow of the 70s any more violent than it already was.
Yes, right. Well, that's it. And you know, I mean, you had the gangs over there anyway, and just in general, you know, if you have downtrodden, impoverished, areas of any part of the world, there's going to be crime and violence and so on, and parts of Scotland were no different, and obviously, Glasgow being one of them. So the fact that punk was going to make them more violent, if anything, it was. Yes, there was some violence at punk gigs in Edinburgh and Glasgow and elsewhere, no doubt. But in some ways, when young kids have a focus for their rage, you put it into art and into clothing and fashion and writing fanzines and all that sort of stuff, writing lyrics, songs, storytelling, poetry, whatever it may be, it gets them off the streets. It stops them punching each other in the face. So I don't know. I think there's a turning point, end of the 70s into the 80s. I think Scotland, in a weird way, starts to become a little bit more hopeful, and that's reflected in its, you could say, cultural renaissance, perhaps.
So. And I think punk in that sense, I'm fascinated by it as well, and I was fairly young when it was happening, but these are the books I go back to, London Thunder and all of the London Streaming, I should say, and read heavily into it, because it seems like a ground zero for culture, not just music, for culture. A lot of the world was done away with, and people, and unfortunately a lot of great bands were maybe overlooked for that reason. They were still making great music, and it was seen as not being punk, but it seemed like it always had to happen for the next stage.
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, I was a bit of a year zero punk, post-punk, that's it. Stuff before that's boring old fart music. But actually, I'm not of that opinion anymore. I love the beat stuff, and I love, like, I'm not the most knowledgeable person about prog rock, but I love good prog rock now.
That's like John Lydon, who also had to say that he was using punk back to it. Do you know what?
I like Van de Graaff Generator, and I like Hawkwind, and no, and I'm not one of those people at all. And I think we need to. There are certain tastemakers that run the establishment now in terms of the media, and for them, year zero was punk and post-punk and synth pop and so on. And so they try and write prog and blues rock and all of these things that happened in this folk rock and so on out of the history books. They were big, they were popular, and they were massively popular in Scotland as well.
What was really interesting to me about the beginning of the book was the stories like what was happening in Glasgow at the time, the kind of importance of music being played in pubs and people turning up and playing together in pubs.
Yeah.
So one of the other things I got from it was returning to records which I loved when I was younger, and I'd forgotten about. For me, it was Bronze to Reach Age of Consent, which is an astonishing record. For all sorts of reasons, it is an incredible record. Was there similar for you? Was there things that you revisited because you hadn't listened to them for a while?
Yeah, and things. Well, that's a good example as well. And diving into the Associates again, and also I wanted to give mentions to bands that I saw and that was into, like Dog-Faced Hermans and things like that. They were John Peel favourites, totally insane bands that. Were really unique. So I was in America last year, and I found a Dog-Faced Herman 7-inch in a record shop somewhere. But yeah, it was, of course, finding and digging into all the '60s stuff and discovering a lot of that for the first time, and then going through all of these. And also reappraising things as well. I mean, I might not have been into some of the blue-eyed soul stuff in the 80s, but actually you listen back to those records and a lot of them are really good. A lot of them sound a bit dated and not that good, but, and broadcasting, when I started on Radio 1 and doing BBC stuff in Scotland in 1999, it changed my life in so many different ways. One of the ways was most people are like, I love it, I hate it. When it comes to music or art in general, film, whatever, but say music, I love that or I hate it, and there's no grey area. Suddenly, when you're broadcasting and you're appraising and reappraising people's work, they're sending you their hard toil recorded. You can't just go, that's shite. You've got to go, well, wait a minute. The person's, learn how to play the instrument, learn how to craft a song of some description, put their personal effort and time into it, and then had the confidence, the courage to record it and try and send it and get it played on the radio. I mean, it's everyone's insecure, but putting your music out there for someone to just palm it off and just go, nah, it's rubbish. I think that's so unfair. So it made me, it opened my mind to being more tolerant.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what Peel did. That was the great thing about Peel's show. Right? He would play.
I'm sure there were records that he probably didn't even like occasionally that he would play, but he played them because they needed a platform. And I realised that there is a small amount of stuff that I really like, and there's a small amount of stuff that I really hate, and a massive grey area in between. So that's it's something that I've come across and realised, and so reappraising a lot of the records and the artists from the 80s that perhaps weren't my cup of tea at the time. When we made the 4-part radio series for the BBC, which was again in a slightly different format from the book and the exhibition and the TV thing. But one of the best interviewees was Tommy Cunningham from Wet Wet Wet. He's an absolute star. He was really funny. He had great anecdotes, great stories. He was courteous, decent, and you got to remember that they started off as a kind of wannabe kind of punk new wave band doing Clash and magazine covers. Then it was just when they got their new singer at the time, Marty Pello, that they just realised he can't sing these songs, and we've got to kind of play to our strengths, which was to be more commercial sounding and more pop. And so they ended up going in that direction. But they came out of punk like everyone else
And
did.
I remember seeing them on, it was something like FSD or some
Yeah.
show, and it was like, here's this new band that are influenced by Willie Nelson, and they kind of, I think they recorded an album, I think, over in Memphis.
They did, yeah.
So they were being pushed in a certain way until someone at a record company went, yeah,
Hang on, this guy's got a cheeky wee smile and a glint in his eye, and if we,
and
can sing, and the band can play, and we just polish it up a little bit, and hey presto, millions of screaming girls are chasing them down the street, and Tommy was like, I remember asking him about it and saying, was there a point when you were like selling millions of records, but going, I wish we had critical acclaim, and he said, yes. We did wish we had critical acclaim. We did want the Enemy and everyone else to tell everyone how cool we were. But we were quite happy with the Screaming Girls and the millions of record sales. And you know what? I think, people
who listen to music can afford to have that kind of attitude, but when you're actually in it making it.
Yeah, and I don't care what anyone says, though, bands that have critical acclaim and everyone's patting them on the back and saying how great they are, but they sell 3 records, all they want to do is sell millions of records and have screaming girls chasing down the streets, or whatever, screaming boys chasing down the streets for their girls. But, it's the grass is always greener. You just want that critical acclaim, but you also want to be a success.
I think an interesting band in that effect are Simple Minds, because if you only knew Simple Minds from Belfast Child, Mandela Day, all that, the big stadium sound, and people I knew did, but I'd known them from their earlier, German influenced electronic stuff, which is still an amazing record.
Yeah.
Then go and listen to this stuff. This is incredible, even if you don't like that later stuff. And then they kind of almost return to that. Because these bands are still making music. Yeah,
and I have to say, I just the other day, I was someone was asking me, what kind of. In fact, it was last night. I went to see a band, and I was chatting to the guys afterwards, and we were having a beer and just discussing music and stuff. And they were kind of like, kind of looking for new things to listen to. And I said, trotted out some new stuff that they might be interested in listening to. But I also said, go and dig out the first 4 or 5 albums by Simple Minds. And they sort of looked at me like, thinking, don't you forget about me, whatever, like, come on. And I was like, no, go and dig out those the first 4 especially, maybe even first 5. They're astonishing, pioneering, interesting sounding records. As you mentioned, the German krautrock kind of cosmic music from the 70s is a big influence. The discovery of the synthesizer as a lead instrument, just different kinds of song formats. They obviously discovered their love and skill of writing pop, but they were into experimental music, and there's a period when they're combining the two to great effect, and those records still sound good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested in the chapters about the labels, the shops, the venues, the things that we all, no matter what our tastes, we interact with. Was it important to have them in the
Yeah, and again, it was one of these things I wanted to mention every shop that's ever stood and sold records in Scotland, and every record label, and you just can't. And
you did go at it.
I tried my best. It's like everything. In the book, I've tried to fit the sort of depth of information in there, but still make it readable. I mean, I hope I managed to get the balance right. I mean, you don't want just lists, but at the same time, if you are doing something which says the story of Scottish pop on the outside of it, then you want to try and represent as much as possible. And I know that some of the shops have been in, like a few of them have been in touch on Twitter or whatever and said thanks for the mention and so on. But yeah, it's really important. I was born abroad, but I grew up near St Andrews, and so buying records initially would have been John Menzies, and then there was a wee shop in St Andrews that we used to go to called Tracks, and then when my mum would allow me to get on the bus and go to Dundee, that's where you could go to Groucho's and Chalmers and Joy, and actually, I mean, it was a treasure trove. These shops were like, I know it may seem to anyone listening who's of a certain age and much younger than me, and they're like, what's he on about? Reminiscing about shops, but without the internet and without the ability to just buy anything or stream anything at the click of a button, you had to do your research and you had to go looking for things. But when you found a good shop, like a Chalmers and Joy, like a Groucho's in Dundee, they had concert tickets, they had posters, patches, T-shirts, scarves, badges, all of that stuff, and tons and tons and tons of vinyl and cassettes. And you know, this is pre-CD even. And you know, if I had whatever pocket money I had, which wasn't always a lot, but when I had anything, it went on records and badges. So I can remember a typical trip to Dundee would mean me getting on the bus with my friend James, now James Yorkston, singer-songwriter, and we'd get on the bus and it would take us through St Andrews and then over the Tay Bridge and so on to Dundee. We'd get off, we'd have a wander around town, try not to get our heads kicked in by the casuals, because we were the weirdos with our Doc Martens on and stuff. And then try maybe be able to afford a 7-inch or two, and maybe an album, depending on how. And maybe a Wimpy burger or whatever we were on at that time, and then spend an afternoon, get on the bus back, and you'd pore over the liner notes or whatever, and it was. You couldn't wait to get home and stick that Clash 7-inch or whatever it is that I'd bought on the turntable and listen to the B-side and so on. I mean, it seems ridiculous when everything is so immediate now, but it was really important to me, and I know to so many others.
I think you were talking about the echo chamber, how that's important, that you're not just hearing the same things that everyone in your chamber or circle is hearing because that's all you're hearing about, if you like. What was great about that for me was I would go into town, in the outskirts of Glasgow, and come back with a Stevie Wonder double album, or something that I never meant to go in and buy, but I'd be flicking through it and go, oh, this looks quite good, or this looks quite good, and it would help your eclecticism and your musical taste. You weren't just kind of pushed into one thing.
I think most music fans, I certainly was like this. I was quite tribal when I first started. I mean, it was Adam and the Ants. That was it. That's all I was into. And then it was and Madness, and then the Specials, and then we got into punk, and then punk. It was just punk, and then we got into reggae, and then before you know it, the doors are blown off, and you're looking for hip hop, you're looking for indie music, goth, eventually electronic music, and so on as well. And going into these shops, you'd flick through the racks and you'd find, or you'd see things, like the cover would entice you, and you're like, what the hell is this? And if you were brave enough, you might ask them to play a bit of it in the shop or something like that. Sometimes you just took a gamble.
Yeah, absolutely.
The cover looks...
It doesn't pay off.
No, absolutely. I've got a few things, because I try not to chuck away records. So I've got, I'm lucky enough to get sent a lot of music and have been for the last 20 years or whatever, but I keep as much as I possibly can, especially things that I bought over the years, and so I'm like, I remember buying that and hating it at the time, and I quite like it now.
Yeah. Richard Johnson's solo album for me was like that.
Oh, I've never even heard that.
Oh, yeah. I can't remember what it's called now, but I'll let you know later.
I interviewed Richard Jobson and Claire Grogan and Faye Fife at the museum last week, and it was fantastic. I mean, they're all kind of heroes to me, and it was sold out. There was about 300 people there or so, and it was a great atmosphere. And we ended up talking for about an hour and 40 minutes. We got questions from the audience. It was like a sort of overview of the time, but also we went into specifics with each of them, and they couldn't have been nicer. And it was a really, really nice, just generous evening of chat. And I just steered the ship and let them chat away. We could have done a one-on-one with any of the three of them,
But again, these are artists who are still going, still playing. I went to see the Skids in the ABC2 last year. It was sold out, mobbed. It's incredible. Similarly with Hipsway, because you think Hipsway were a small-ish band in the mid-80s. Man, they had a lot of fans that are still fans now.
Oh, totally, yeah.
So
there's a record that I probably if not sneered at, but certainly just that's not my thing. The Honey Thief. When you hear that now, it's really funky. I mean, it's properly good. It's got that kind of production of the time, but it's great. And there you go. These artists are all playing their. Either reforming and doing it again, or have never kind of stopped.
Yeah, they've kept on going.
Yeah,
I've seen the Zillows over the years many times. So
yeah, well, they're great. Yeah.
We're talking about the importance of record shops and things like that, but these days it's online, and actually what you're saying is if you're looking, when your musical tastes explode and you think, oh, I want to try electronic, it's never been easier to do that side of things, to go and find stuff. How do you view the way that music business in that sense is going?
We're in a crux period of history when it comes to everything now. I mean, when it comes to politics or whatever, I mean, God knows what's going on in the world. But
finding vinyl might not be a problem.
Yeah. It's the least of our worries. But yes, in terms of streaming and music consumption and so on, it's completely different now. And I'm not a kind of doom and gloom merchant when it comes to it's not as good as it was in my day. I do think, I mean, there was me glorifying the art of record shopping, or the act of it, if not the art of it.
But that's partly because that's when both of us first came into contact with music, and that he always.
I think there's something slightly sad in the fact that people won't ever have that mystery that we had, and because that mystery. It generates anticipation and it generates excitement. And you know, if my dad took us down, like my brother and I, down to London for like, you know, a weekend or whatever, to visit my grandparents who lived there for a wee while, I was at that age when I was able to go to like Virgin Records or whatever it would be on Oxford Street, and the supplies they had, you know, Dad, can you lend me a tenner, you know, or whatever, yeah, there you go. And then I'd be able to get a couple of really, like, albums I'd wanted for years and not been able to get in Scotland, in Fife or whatever. But, and now, it's, you know, that anticipation and excitement's gone. So I do think that's slightly sad, but I think what's going to happen is, or it's yet to really present itself, I think there's going to be a new kind of music fan and a new kind of music consumer in a way. If you've got access to 7 decades of pop and rock, that's going to do something to young minds in a positive way as well as a negative way. I'd like to think that young people and people who consume vast amounts of music are going to come out with something pretty amazing soon. We've maybe not seen it yet because I think everyone's getting their heads around the internet and how you do it. But it's completely different. I think that's why you have these slightly retro ideas of going back and buying vinyl and obsessing about record shops and so on. But I also think, how can it be a bad thing if you've got access to all the good music? You know,
find any track that you pretty much like.
You know, the Sex Pistols would cover No Fun by the Stooges. I would have to find No Fun, and it would take me ages to find it because John Peel wouldn't be playing it, and you know, you'd have to find the record. And okay, John Menzies don't stock the Stooges' first album, so it would be now. Oh, Vic Galloway mentioned the Stooges on Radio Scotland last night. Who are they? Click. Oh, downloaded their entire back catalogue. I mean, that's got in some ways that's got to be an amazing thing, and so streaming is yet to even itself out, and I'm worried about how the artists themselves are compensated. But I think eventually they're going to get that kind of recompense right for the people, but they better do it soon because people don't mind going out and spending 30, 40, 50 quid in a pub getting pissed on a Friday night, but I've heard people saying $7.99 for all the music, you know, $7.99 for a subscription to Spotify or whatever it may be, for all the music or thereabouts, you know. You know, that's a bit steep. I'm like, you know, that's not even 2 pints nowadays, 8 quid, you know what I mean? And so I do think people have to dig deep and put their hands in their pockets for art again. Art isn't free. That's what worries me about the internet, is because everyone's got so used to just clicking on YouTube or whatever it is and finding any song they want, and they actually resent paying for it. I think people are a bit more willing to pay for live music, which is fine, but I think recorded music, they need to reimburse people. It costs money to record, and it's time, it's effort, learning your instrument, learning your craft, learning how to record, even if you are doing home recordings on a laptop. The laptops aren't free. You know, you've got an expensive one opposite me. That costs a couple of £1,000, that thing. You know, where does that come from? You don't get that on a...
get jumped on the way home.
But you know, you can't get one of them on a paper round when you're a teenager. You know, you've got to have rich parents, or you've got to be lucky in some way. You know, and so people need to be reimbursed somehow. If you're a working class musician and you want to forge your way in the world, you need to get paid every now and again.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so that's my worry.
Where does radio fit into this thing? Because I think at the moment, particularly BBC Radio Scotland, you think want to go Smoke Anywhere yourself, Roddy Hart Show and Nicola May Show. And fantastic radio shows, some of the best music shows we've got.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, to me, that's a really healthy situation.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea what the future of Radio Scotland is going to be, but I really hope I can play a part in it. I love doing the programmes for the BBC, and I love for Radio Scotland. I love doing occasional stints on Six Music, and obviously I was on Radio 1 for years as well. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I want that to continue. I mean, I can only hope, I'm in my mid-40s now, I can only hope that I can still do it in 10 years, 20 years, possibly even 30 years' time. I mean, you know, do a kind of John Peely type thing and keep going, because I still have the enthusiasm and the hunger, and you hear bands and you hear music that shall we say is disappointing occasionally. They could be good, or they could be better than they are. They just need a little bit more originality thrown in there or whatever. But when I hear that thing that jumps out, no matter what genre, and it's just like, oh, these guys are onto something, wow, this is exciting, I still get that buzz.
And I think it's one of the few places where people like that can get their music heard by a wider audience. A wider audience that maybe don't go to gigs or aren't buying music online, or even maybe don't listen to Spotify, but they still make.
Well, and the thing is, weirdly enough, radio hit its highest global listening figures in 2017. I mean, it's never been more popular across. You know, that will include speech radio, talk radio, and all the rest of the news and yada yada yada. But it's never been more popular. And I think actually, even though Buggles sang "Video Killed the Radio Start," it didn't. And
video's pretty much gone. Radio's still
radio and the internet hasn't killed radio either. In fact, if you look at Catch Up, Listen Again, you know, all of these kind of non-linear ways of consuming music and so on, and art and culture. Radio pioneered. The iPlayer was radio before TV, remember, and all those different forms of, whether it be Netflix or, you know, all these different kind of online platforms. It was radio that pioneered all of that stuff, and podcasting like you're doing right now. I believe in radio because you can get more. I'm into content over style in a way. I love style as well, but I prefer content and TV and sort of visual representation. People are often attracted to the hunky guy ripped with his abs, or the sexy girl with her hot pants or whatever, whereas on radio, you're listening to the music, you're listening to the tune, the beat, the lyrics, whatever. Again, with politics, I think there are TV programs that try their best to cover politics, but listen to BBC Radio 4 or BBC Radio Scotland, you hear far more in-depth analysis and far better kind of interviews and so on, especially if you're kind of, in the evening. I mean, the Moral Maze, check that programme out. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, the sort of discussions they have on there. So I'm a great believer in radio, and it still survives because people listen to it when they're cooking or doing something else, driving, obviously. And it's mainlined to your brain via your ears. And while people want to multitask, then that's one way in which you can do it, is listen to the radio. And also, when it comes to music, I mean, I would say this because I am one of them in a way, but I believe in the selector, the curator.
Yes, absolutely.
I've overheard someone say, one of the young team somewhere said, I am the best DJ that I know. Well, why would I listen to the radio? Why would I go to a club? I'm the best DJ that I know. I think that's sad. That means you've closed your mind off to someone else's taste in music or someone else's selection of music. I want to listen to Mark Riley or Giles Peterson or Roddy Hart or Nicola Meehan to hear what they come out with. Because, some of it I won't like, lots of it I will. And also, I'll be introduced to something I've never heard before or haven't heard for a while. And I love that. And I don't care how good your algorithm is. I still believe in people making mixtapes and putting together compilations and just going, I saw this band the other day. They're a bit random. You've maybe not heard this kind of stuff before, but check this out. Bang! Mind blown.
Well, I think people still want to have people, as you say, curators that they trust their taste, they trust, and just like, going back to John Peel or Fleetwood Mac or whoever it was, you think, I might not like everything, but you know what? I'm going to like most of it because I like what they do and I like what they give us. It's a trust thing as well. I think that appointment is important, that relationship's important.
John Peel would play lots of African music and lots of reggae and Bhangra and all sorts of stuff. Now, I remember when I was a teenager, I was like, yeah, go on, let's hear the next Fall record or whatever it was. Let's hear that indie band that I'm into at the moment when I was a bit more tribal. But guess what? All of that reggae and Bhangra and African music and so on went in. And now, in many ways, when I'm listening to music on my own, having heard a million different incarnations of indie rock and so on, I will probably go and listen to African music and reggae and Bhangra and get into South American music, jazz. If you've got an inquisitive musical mind, you go out and find different kinds of sounds and textures. And I would put John Peel right up there, alongside friends and family and all sorts of other people that open my mind in different ways to music. But if John Peel had just played 2-3 hours of solid punk or post-punk or indie, I might not have had or have the inquisitive mind that I've got today.
These people are important, absolutely. Yeah. And I would have to say, you're one of those people.
Oh, that's very nice of you. I mean, I try my best. I'm sure Roddy and Nicola and everyone would say the same things. I would love to have more hours on the radio.
6 hour radio.
Yeah. I'd love to have 3-4, shows a week to be able to play something. If you like a single, make it single of the week, and play it 3 or 4 times that week. If you like an album, play 4 tracks from it a week. And so people can dig in. Give a much wider spread of music, well-known stuff from history and brand new stuff, local stuff, international stuff. I think it's important to put Scottish artists next to international artists as well, just to show, one, how good they are and how they stand up, and also just to contextualise what's going on in the world. If someone's reading about an artist from New York and they will want to hear them, well, let's say The Strokes, and so you play The Strokes and then you play Catholic Action or something next to them, you realise, well, you know what, Catholic Action are every bit as good as them.
Absolutely.
Or whatever it may be.
Sure. Well, I think that's the perfect place to finish. So Vic, thanks so much for doing this, really appreciate it.
Not at all, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Alistair.
And we'll be back soon for podcast 101 with someone completely different. Cheers.